you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us tonight for the history of redlining, real estate, and race with Dr. Paige Glotzer. Dr. Glotzer is the American Assistant Professor and John W. and Jean M. Rowe Chair in the History of American Politics, Institutions, and Political Economy at the University of Madison. Born in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Glotzer made her way to us via New York University, where she studied history and political science and minored in architecture and urban design. She received her master's and PhD in urban history from Johns Hopkins University and completed postdoctorate studies at Harvard at the Joint Center for History and Economics before joining the UW-Madison team in 2018. Dr. Glotzer is also an award-winning author. Her most recent book, How the Suburbs Were Segregated, won the 2022 Lewis Mumford Award for Best Book on the History of American City and Regional Planning, and the 2021 Kenneth Jackson Award for the Best Book on Urban History in North America. We are thrilled to have her join us tonight to share with you the impact and legacy of redlining throughout the U.S. and in our neighborhoods. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paige Glotzer. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great. It's really an honor to be here tonight. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Brandy and Amy and everyone who organized the big read. It's my first time in Kenosha, and it's, I just think, a great way to experience the city for the first time, to really be here at the public library. So I don't think that it's surprising to anyone in this room to say that American cities tend to be racially segregated. Neighborhoods are, for example, mostly black or white. And neighborhoods that are not majority white have historically, though not always, tended to be poorer, the buildings in worse shape, and they receive fewer city services. And meanwhile, if you think of the suburbs, they have historically been wealthier and whiter. And I just wondered why, and that really drove my research. And I specifically came to ask two questions. Why does housing segregation seem to be so pervasive? Why does it just seem to keep continuing despite so many changes in American society? And then why does it take certain forms but not others? Right? Housing segregation follows certain patterns. It looks a certain way. And I wanted to know why those ways. And so as I was doing research, historical research, I started to really come to think that the answers lie with how some of the earliest white suburban developers experimented with racial segregation as a tactic to increase sales all the way back at the turn of the 20th century. And I then kind of followed some of these developers forward in time and realized that they talked to each other. They disseminated their practices, and then they helped standardize them through national associations, and then they helped federal policymakers codify these practices into discriminatory housing policies like redlining, beginning in the 1930s and 40s. So for those of you familiar with the history of American suburbs, you might think of suburbs as really a post-World War II phenomenon. But developers laid the groundwork for post-war housing discrimination long before. So I actually begin in the 1890s. That's where we're going to start tonight. And you could actually even go back further than that. There are certain intellectual or political or even legal precedents that inform the 1890s. But it was that decade, where some of the realtors who played crucial roles in those mid-century policies like redlining, it's where they really began to gain a platform to shape the national housing market in a discriminatory way. And these federal policies are often what historians, but I think also a growing group of people in the United States really use to account for both the rise of large segregated metropolitan areas, but also a white consumer base that was and sometimes still is willing to defend housing segregation. So I'll be starting pretty far from Kenosha tonight by highlighting one developer based in Baltimore, Maryland, called the Roland Park Company. And it's the company that is at the center of my book, and I did a lot of research on them over the years, but I still think that it's relevant for us here, very far from Baltimore. Beginning in 1891, the company developed over 2,500 acres in northern Baltimore, and its officers played key roles in those processes I just mentioned, disseminating practices, standardizing them nationally through professional associations, and working with federal policymakers. So I can kind of think of this history as both a case study, but also a network, and that's really the big piece here, a network of realtors, planners, and policymakers. So first I'm gonna zoom in to Baltimore and see how the Roland Park Company experimented with planning and design and sales tactics that gave that particular and new shape to how housing segregation worked. But then I'm going to follow their money, their ideas, their personnel as they standardize them and help to turn housing, suburban and urban housing segregation into enduring policy nationally, including right here in Kenosha. So to really start, developers like the Roland Park Company were facing different financial imperatives at the turn of the 20th century. Previously, especially in the 19th century, a lot of builders thought really short term. Build a couple of houses, get out of the game before certain financial obligations came due. But suburban developers were starting to think of planned communities, and they were thinking long term. And in order to think long term, they started to introduce different types of tools into how they could control the long-term future of a neighborhood or of a development. One of those tools was something called restrictive covenants. So what are restrictive covenants? Restrictive covenants became a community-wide set of rules that were legally binding. They ran with the deeds of houses very often, or maybe deeds mentioned a separate document that was linked to them, started by, say, a neighborhood association. And that neighborhood association was often talking with the developer. So examples that you might find in restrictive covenants. Each house had to be set back a minimum amount from the street. Each house had to be made of certain material, and each house had to have a minimum cost. These were not just things about the look and feel of the development, though. Each of those actually function as a form of class discrimination. So the minimum cost may be the most obvious one, but a house having to be set back from the street meant you had to be able to purchase the larger lot. And a house having to be made of certain material meant you had to be able to purchase that material, or at least factor that into the cost of the house. So right away, restrictive covenants kind of set up a way that the sort of how a property was going to look or function was going to be tied to who could live there. But restrictive covenants gained some infamy not because of these seemingly colorblind types of controls, but there were other types of restrictions that went in there. And this includes one of the first community-wide types of racial restrictions. So this is a lot of text, but this is actually an excerpt from a Roland Park Company restrictive covenant. And I want to draw your attention to that middle paragraph. And I'll also preface this by saying that the word Negro was the polite term for African Americans in the early 20th century. It's a little different from a different word. But it says that essentially that at no time shall the land included in said tract or any part of be occupied by any African American or a person of African American extraction. They draw an exception for domestic servants, which kind of gives you an idea about the labor that went in to planned suburbs. But this is kind of here. So to sum it up, essentially, if you were Black, you couldn't live in, or even purchase a house in this community in Baltimore. But I want to also kind of draw this attention to where in the restrictive covenants this racial restriction fell, because this is going to be part of that history about why segregation assumes certain forms but not others. It was in the middle of something called a nuisance clause. and it was sandwiched between restrictions on livestock and restrictions on smoke. It didn't have its own section, the racial restriction. It was grouped with other things, including livestock and smoke. So this idea that race could somehow be tied to a notion of nuisance, something that was about health and safety, really provided the sort of language that you would start to hear in terms of thinking about race and the look, feel, and rules and mechanics of a planned suburb. But in addition to these covenants, and this was the Roland Park Company's covenant, but I'll get to how it became a very widespread thing in a few moments. In addition to covenants, developers had other ways of signaling to affluent white buyers that a development could be exclusive and that essentially there could be long-term guarantees that this would be a profitable and nice place to live. And that would be in the very planning and design. So as a historian, I always like to read the streetscape, really think about what the built environment can tell you about the history of a place. And in the case of the Roland Park Company's developments, we can maybe get a few lessons in how to do that. And then you can kind of maybe go out and do that perhaps in areas where you go all the time. But I want to draw your attention to this neighborhood called Guilford, which was the second development of the Roland Park Company and one that had the racial restrictions you just saw. This is actually a recent, like a modern map because the streets are more or less the same. And it's in Baltimore, it's very close to Johns Hopkins University. So this is the eastern boundary of Guilford. That's a street called York Road. It's a sort of big road in Baltimore. But I want to kind of show how essentially Guilford was built next to an older set of neighborhoods. And these were mixed race and mixed class neighborhoods. And the Roland Park Company took that into account with how they planned Guilford. So notice the lack of through streets between Guilford and the areas that already were there, that were mixed race and mixed class neighborhoods. The one street that does go through, I put in blue, 39th Street, had to because it had a sewer underneath it. But otherwise, it was very deliberate that the streets didn't connect up to each other. The Roland Park Company also just built a wall, a straight up wall. That's my picture because that wall is still there. You'll see a lot of examples of this, especially in places like Detroit. You'll also see this in Milwaukee. But this wall was, which is 14 feet high, was a way of signaling to buyers that they wouldn't essentially have to even imagine that they were living near a mixed race and mixed class neighborhood. This kind of cut off the sight lines of Guilford. And in looking at the company's records, this was actually the way that the developer talked about it. They said that this would protect people in Guilford from quote unquote eyesores. And eyesores was again referring to both people and the look and feel of the property. So again, that same conflation that you'd see in the covenants, that logic is starting to spill out into other ways. There's also a set of houses in Guilford that are attached houses as opposed to single-family detached houses. These form a de facto extension of the wall because they're attached houses, and they don't face York Road at all. These were Guilford's smallest and cheapest houses, as opposed to the largest and most expensive houses at the center, the furthest away from York Road. So when you put these all together, you have about a mile of almost a solid boundary that cuts Guilford off from the areas to the east. So now, the Roland Park Company didn't necessarily know if it could do all of this legally, if this would be acceptable. So they actually talked to their lawyers about this, about the restrictive covenants, about the idea of deliberately calling their neighborhoods restricted or segregated. And their lawyers, and this is actually one of my main light bulb moments in my research, in 1893, the lawyer said, "You can't do this. This is unacceptable." And that shocked me, because I just assumed that in the 1890s they'd say, okay, fine, and it would only be later that maybe there would be opposition to this. But that's not what happened. In the 1890s, when restrictive covenants were new, the lawyer said, you can't do that. That would be an embarrassment to the state of Maryland, which had one of the largest Black populations in the country. But they did it anyway. And they were they were able to get away with it, and it was essentially backed up by the courts over and over again for a very long time. But this was just one way that the Roland Park Company essentially announced a presence in Baltimore, and it started to actually really draw a crowd. So affluent people, especially native-born white folks from Baltimore, started to move up there, further and further away from the older centers of Baltimore, where you really had incoming immigrants from all over the world, where you had a very large population of African Americans who had gone back generations in Baltimore prior to this. And this was essentially a way that folks could essentially separate themselves out and talk about living in a place that was, and they would say, safe and healthy. Those were always the buzzwords. Now, that idea of relying on health and safety to sell a segregated suburb also really clued me in to how developers started to gain a political platform in the early 20th century. And it was beginning with how to plan out segregated suburbs. So beginning in the early 20th century, it turned out that suburban developers and sometimes city governments were engaged in the same types of things: laying out streets, laying out sewers, laying out lighting. And city planning was very new. So in the case of Baltimore, there were people who went from public payroll to private payroll all the time, including, say, some very famous landscape architects named the Olmsted brothers, the sons of the people who did Central Park in New York, who were working on Guilford's street layout right as they were working on Baltimore's park plan. And the city really saw a type of allyship with developers as a group to share resources with, to share supplies and personnel with. And this meant that when the Roland Park Company wanted something, such as priority access to a new pipe, they didn't have as much work to do to get heard as, say, an entire working class neighborhood in Baltimore did. And so I have comparisons in the archive where, for instance, it took 100 petitions in a poor neighborhood in Baltimore to get a single sewer laid, whereas the Roland Park Company got to jump the line, even though the Baltimore city sewer system made no sense being put up there when it did, because it still didn't attach to anything, but they still got that priority access. And so in terms of thinking about planning, that's one of the ways that developers actually started to build power and build political relationships to bolster segregated suburbs. But there were other linkages to planners, policymakers, and other developers further afield. So the Roland Park Company started to get requests for copies of its restrictive covenants from all over the country, from planners, from other developers, and from policymakers, including from, that's not Baltimore sewers, including from John Nolan, who spent a lot of time in Wisconsin, including in Kenosha, very active in city planning. So again, this is a lot of text, and I don't need you to read all of this, but what I want to draw your attention to here is that John Nolan essentially took a Roland Park Company deed restriction, or restrictive covenant, crossed out the place names and wrote Florida on it, and just used it, essentially. You can actually trace the way restrictive covenants traveled throughout the country through looking at things like the letters, the correspondence between developers and policymakers. So the same people who were behind these types of developments sat on some of your first zoning boards as they started to be created in the 1920s. So even the municipal divisions of how city spaces would be used started to share a lineage with suburban development. And as restrictive covenants and as ideas about zoning, which were also sometimes modeled on restrictive covenants, as they spread, you saw that developers and landscape architects and planners helped to adapt the language to local conditions. So for example, Baltimore had a lot of restrictive covenants that had language specifically against Black people, but one of the restrictive covenants from the Roland Park Company was taken to Southern California, where language against Mexican Americans was inserted because of the local racial geography of Southern California. This circulation of covenants changed the way cities were organized, especially in terms of setting zoning policies. There really is a shared history there. But I also want to kind of signpost how then we can see not just the movement of these ideas and their movement between public and private, but how then these ideas started to become national in general. So I want to move now to essentially how after a decade of circulating these types of restrictions through informal correspondence networks, the Roland Park Company was one of the founders of the National Association of Realtors, still headquartered in Chicago today. At the time, they had a slightly different name, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, or NAREB. And at that time, in around 1910s, realtors were not respected at all. In fact, the popular view was that they were scam artists out to make a quick buck. So NAREB sought to professionalize real estate, make it seem respectable, and in part to do that, they wanted to set best practices. What would realtors have to do in order to actually be able to, say, get a license? They were behind licensing laws. And to what could they do to maintain membership in this important professional association? Well, suburban developers exercised a disproportionate amount of power in helping this project of setting best practices because they were seen as the least scammy realtors, the ones who already had the most respect. So they were kind of like the celebrities of the real estate world. And so people were really willing to listen to them regardless about what people's businesses might actually be as members. So what did realtors think of themselves and what did they hope the public would think about? Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that happened. Think of them. So this is what you get when you start looking at the National Association of Realtors archives. This is one example of how realtors were trying to get themselves seen and how they were thinking about themselves. And this is important for the history of segregation because realtors tried to see themselves and construct this image of them as upstanding members of communities who had expert knowledge, right? They were kind of dressed in classical garb here as if they were kind of like Greek intellectuals, right? And they were bringers of progress. That's why they're holding the car. And this sort of realtor is surrounded by scenes that realtors wanted to take credit for in Detroit in the 1920s, including bustling smokestacks, very happy white workers, and a suburban house with a nuclear family that could have fit in Roland Park. But what was behind this image? What did realtors actually codify as best practices? Well, they codified a relationship between segregation and what it meant to be a good realtor. So that when realtors adopted a code of ethics, it included this. Realtors would be prohibited from introducing, quote, into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence would clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So they made the leap to not just mixing up the look and feel of a place with who lived there, but directly tying race to property value. And what they meant was that essentially the less white an area, the lower the value would be. And so integrating a neighborhood would harm a neighborhood. And in their mind, property values only went down with the presence of people of color. They never really thought of it in any other way. So this was something that realtors became duty-bound to do, regardless of whatever their own personal beliefs may have been. This was the way to be a practicing realtor, beginning in the 1920s. So this idea that race was tied to property value is an extension of the logic of the covenants, the logic of zoning, and the way that streets were laid out. Realtors deliberately worded this broadly, and in doing so, they devolved wide-ranging discretionary powers to individual brokers, individual realtors, and they mandated that they use those powers. So NAREB really helped to start solidifying a racial hierarchy, a whole essentially set of understandings of different types of people relating to the value of property in different ways. Now that still never had a kind of totalizing effect on how real estate business was conducted, because ultimately most realtors still thought locally. And that means then that if we go back to, say, the Roland Park Company and look at the hyper-local decision-making that, say, salesmen had, you can see something that is kind of way more complex than what this type of code of ethics may lead you to think. So for example, and I want to take you through 2 examples of this kind of quickly, the Roland Park Company also had a whole set of private-facing office documents, not restrictive covenants, which were public-facing. These were private documents in the office, where they also debated everybody who they would call questionably white, because racial categories change over time. And in the 1920s and 30s, somebody who may have been Jewish, Italian, Greek, may not have had the same full access to the benefits of being called white that they would later on. So essentially, one of the things you can see is them debating what types of white people that we would call white potentially could live in Roland Park. And this is where you get religious exclusion. It's where you get exclusion based on nationality, sometimes based on the surnames, on the visibility of people potentially dressing in a way that they thought was too ethnic. So you have a whole set of really sometimes ambiguous modes of exclusion playing out. Sometimes it was very blunt though, like in this case, Jews were not allowed to live in the Roland Park Company developments, except when they were, because occasionally someone would get an exception if they promised to be entirely secular and they had friends who knew the Roland Park Company associates. So they were considered to be a good and acceptable Jew, but that's very porous, right? So that porousness is very, very different than the experience of African Americans who tried to essentially become homeowners in Baltimore. Because remember that exclusion files, which were just literally stamped exclusion, were still different from restrictive covenants, which the Roland Park Company had no problem, again, declaring as a public-facing document. So all of these conversations took place with the idea that while there was a certain type of porousness, there was still essentially at the bottom of their racial hierarchy were African Americans who were excluded in a different way. And so I think that it's kind of, you can hold both these things at once, that their segregation and exclusion operated and applied to a lot of different groups, but they didn't necessarily all constrain different groups in the same ways or by the same mechanisms. And that had some long-ranging implications. Now, ideas filtered both down and up through the National Association. But by the time of the Great Depression, you had the National Association of Real Estate Boards selling things like filing equipment so that people could organize their exclusion files. Right? This was from a catalog in the National Association of Real Estate Boards. Right? Very blunt. Right? This was not hidden. People were not ashamed of this, which I think is also important to keep in mind. This was not done in secret as something people thought was shameful. This was very much considered best practices. By the time of the Great Depression, realtors really had achieved their aim of making NAREB seem like the place of experts, of expert knowledge on the real estate profession. And so when the federal government tried to seek out experts, consultants, to help with the emergency housing situation that was emerging in the Great Depression, they turned to NAREB as the people who could help them write the policies that would be New Deal era housing policies. What do I mean by New Deal era housing policies? And this is where we can get to redlining. So briefly, what is redlining? And it was also in Kenosha. So this is a Kenosha redlining map, and I will explain what this means. So essentially, people were in danger during the Great Depression of not being able to pay their mortgages. At the same time, banks were going under in part because people couldn't pay back mortgages. And construction industry activity had largely stopped because, well, people couldn't afford to buy houses. So the Great Depression was bad for banks, construction, and homeowners. And the federal government wanted to do something that would help out all those groups in one fell swoop. So they said, let's get into the mortgage business. So the federal government created an agency called HOLC, the Home Owners Loans Corporation, the HOLC, HOLC, that essentially identified distressed mortgages, directly purchased them, refinanced them in a completely new way, which gives us the modern mortgage, 25 or 30 years with uniform payments. That's a Great Depression era thing. And then they serviced them themselves. So the federal government essentially serviced mortgages. to decide which mortgages they would purchase. In other words, which people, which banks, which construction sectors they would help out. They wanted to develop criteria for which mortgages they should handle. And so they took essentially that criteria, they asked realtors about it, and they mapped over 200 cities across the country and rated which parts of those cities were good for the federal government to bail out and refinance mortgages and help people stay in their homes through a form of that, again, federal investment essentially, and which areas would not get that. And so you have then the redlining maps, where in the green areas were the most desirable, the places that were considered lowest risk, meaning the federal government thought we should really help, we should do that. That's a good idea. Nothing's gonna really be bad in 20, 30 years when we're still handling those mortgages. And that went down to blue, which was still pretty okay, and then yellow, which was getting very dicey for them. And then you had the redlined areas, and they're called redlined areas because of these maps, which were colored red and essentially became no-go zones for the federal government to help out people in distress. This on its own might give you an indication then that there were some disparate impacts between maybe different parts of cities and who got to essentially maintain homeownership during the Great Depression. But we actually have more than the redlining maps themselves. We have the criteria, the actual documents behind the maps. And I want to actually spend a little bit of time going over that with you now for Kenosha so we can actually see very explicitly how redlining worked. So again, you're going to see a lot of text, but don't worry, I'm going to walk us through it. So notice Kenosha only had one A-rated area. It was actually a little bit unusual as a city to only have one. Cities usually had more than one, but it only had one. And then it had some really big redlined areas. So that whole circle is one single redlined area, D3. So they didn't necessarily map onto like historic neighborhood divisions either. And then let's look at the criteria behind that A area. So yeah, I guess the text is a little bit small, but I will go over it. Essentially, before you even look at the answers that Hulk filled in on there, just looking at what was the boilerplate criteria that was being evaluated is very, very telling. So we start with things such as what are the good influences or what are the bad influences in the area. And I'll get to the answers in a moment. But then look at inhabitants. Essentially, again, the boilerplate language used for all 200 plus cities. Hulk wanted to know, essentially, are there foreign-born families there? Are there black people there? They actually carved that out as like black people, yes or no. And then you can put in the percentage. Relief families, so they're looking at things like people who might be on public welfare or accepting charity. And then they look at this concept called infiltration, which comes from plant science. This idea of, is there potentially something called a blight, a spreading disease that's going to harm an area? That's the term, that's the history behind the term infiltration. And what infiltration meant is, what's the future of that area? Because Hulk was in this for the long term, 25 or 30 years. So they didn't just want to know a neighborhood's or an area's current situation. They wanted to get a sense on the future patterns. So this A area is a rare case where the term infiltration is being actually used in a slightly good way, according to Hulk, because they're actually saying in this A-rated area, it's getting better and better, like they're saying the better class is coming. That's usually not how they answer the infiltration question. That usually had a very negative connotation. But now to look at the actual answers for some of these, right? So we also then, again, after inhabitants, have all this stuff about buildings. So again, conflating people and property, right? And this is especially to think about the current and future value, or they would call it the risk of getting into mortgage stuff in those areas. Under favorable influences for, again, Kenosha's one top-rated area, the favorable influence is restrictions. Restrictions means restrictive covenants. So there are racial restrictions, and that's counting in its favor. And the sort of consensus is that this is a better professional type of neighborhood, good folks. So they're tying it essentially to the jobs men had. So executives, right? There's not really a reflection of the women who lived in this neighborhood on this form at all. So also something about how Hulk thought about the household. So this is the A-rated area. I want to get now to the D-rated area, which is the blue circle. So it does have some favorable influences, right? It actually has some schools, some churches. Good public transportation was actually a plus at the time. We weren't yet in the era of car-centered suburbs. So like being near public transportation was actually a good thing. And cities generally had much better public transportation in the 1930s than they do today, right? But let's look at detrimental influences. Straight up, foreign element and Negroes, industrial plants, railroad tracks, Black people, immigrants, factories, and trains. Boom, 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 boom. Again, not a distinction between how those are listed. So again, the logic of conflating the characteristics of people's identities with the built environment in a conversation about property value is on full display for why this area got redlined. Okay. And then they kind of elaborate on that. And of course, Kenosha, with a sort of large historic Italian population, that's really counting against this because Southern and Eastern Europeans were oftentimes not favored, just like in the exclusion files of the Roland Park Company. So it is counting against this area that is heavily Italian, but also the very fact that it is a mixed race area, that they answer yes to the question of are there Black people here, is also counting against it. And in a lot of cities, especially places like Baltimore, any percentage essentially of Black people, regardless of the socioeconomic status of people, could be lawyers, doctors, automatic grounds for redlining. Because no matter how upper class African American neighborhoods might have been, the very fact that people were Black harmed property values. And that was the abiding logic of these forms. So that contributed to why this area was redlined. Now, I kind of just want to have people sort of sit with that for a moment because that's such an important kind of aspect of like how neighborhoods essentially then became areas of other subsequent types of investments over the next 80, 90 years, and how this also sets the stage for a lot of different types of disinvestment, or essentially, again, redlining the name has become synonymous for no-go in terms of investment areas. So as you kind of map redlined areas onto other things that happen later in 20th century, you see that you can often identify the pattern of redlining in things that don't seem to have a direct connection to the New Deal. But just to kind of put like a very fine point on it, NARAB and Hulk closely collaborated, and these documents were collaborative documents because they essentially were made with realtor expertise. And Hulk administrators attended NARAB conventions as professional development on paid time. But isn't all this illegal now, right? So I'm talking about the 1930s. We're in 2023. We're talking about a very long time ago. Why is this still important? What is the legacy of redlining? Well, this is illegal now, but. It's like but. So in 1948, so actually not too long after this, the Supreme Court declared racially restrictive covenants unenforceable, but not illegal. Not illegal, meaning that developers and people, and at that point neighborhood associations, still wanted them because unless they were individually challenged in court, it was fine. They were not illegal, they just wouldn't hold up in court if challenged. And it was very difficult to challenge them in court. There was another federal agency created called the Federal Housing Administration, which took all of these criteria and applied it to the private lending market. So starting in the 1940s, to essentially get really safe, kind of good pots of money to either build developments, like your Levitt towns, or to potentially get really good terms on mortgages to buy homes on the private market, essentially lenders followed these criteria, again, regardless of anyone's individual beliefs. So this essentially extended from emergency era federal housing policy to the entire lending industry very quickly. And that it only became illegal to discriminate based on race in housing in 1968 with fair housing laws. By that point, NARAB had also revised its code of ethics to read, a realtor should not be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or use which will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. So they took out race, they put in use in 1950. But living in a house is a type of use. So this idea of making the seemingly colorblind, but leaving all the other language the same, knowing that race was tied to property value, especially in practice, that was a way of preserving the status quo. And there was explicit conversation in the archives about that being the intent of why they did that, right? It preserved the status quo. So thinking about boundaries and how we can continue then, or the boundaries I showed you, let's go back and look at legacies by looking at some of the stuff I showed you earlier in Baltimore. So I showed you those York Road boundaries, right? This is a way we can kind of think about all the different legacies in space, in the physical environment. This was a redlining map. So you can see York Road was kind of outlined in yellow. There was a redlined area. A lot of the stuff in the yellow and red area was demolished later on in the 20th century. Where you get to green again on the right, that's another Roland Park Company development. So only Roland Park Company developments got that like good coveted A rating. Now let's look at some of this way down the line. So you can start to see York Road become one of the main racial dividing lines in Baltimore. So without even putting the street name on the map, although I did here, you can actually see how racial demographics just suddenly shift by crossing the street. But you can see it in other ways. That's a map of foreclosures from the 2008 housing crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis. This foreclosures disproportionately affected African Americans because of this history of not being able to access mortgages on good terms. So people were essentially much more vulnerable to being steered into subprime mortgages, which were suddenly a lot of access to credit on bad terms. And so subprime mortgages were disproportionately held by African Americans, meaning that when the housing crisis hit in 2008, you can actually map foreclosures using kind of redlining boundaries because you can actually see the racial dimension of foreclosures. But I want to actually show you one other thing as well, and that's the tree map in Baltimore. You can see, again, without showing you where York Road is as a street, you can see where it is. And you can see the outlines of Guilford and that other Roland Park Company development that got that green rating on the map. Trees are municipal resources in most places. So we can see how kind of the history of not just redlining, but the discriminatory planning that came before it reinforces uneven political power across neighborhoods. And that affects resource distribution, neighborhood by neighborhood. And in the case of trees, that also affects people's health too, because trees really have environmental and health consequences. So you can kind of see a lot of layers of the legacy of segregation working in something like tree distribution. So those are just a few examples, and I want to just kind of conclude now before we open it up to questions. I began my talk by saying that most of you wouldn't be surprised that American cities are racially segregated. But I also said that you wouldn't find it surprising that suburbs tend to be wealthier and whiter. But that ascendance of the single family house in the planned segregated suburb to like the very most valuable, most desirable type of property, that wasn't inevitable at all when the Roland Park Company put down roots in Baltimore at the turn of the 20th century. And since it wasn't inevitable, thinking about why it persisted decades later can potentially help us ask hard questions about how things might be able to be changed in the future. And the way to potentially think about those questions, including ones that might cause discomfort, right? To sit with the discomfort of those questions about that history, is to think about the roles of institutions, planning, policy, the built environment, right? To take it beyond the interpersonal one-on-one actions, to see how systems are made and how power can be uneven and how that matters for large areas in the long term. But my research then, and the way I look at this, I try to essentially give things like racism a history, right? Show that they changed over time. Even the categories themselves changed over time. And that became foundational to how housing was valued, imagined, bought, and sold in the 20th century. And because exclusion in all of its forms was much more kind of subtle, much more banal, very kind of much like part of just the everyday work of buying, selling, and thinking about housing. It informed all sorts of connections, including connections that might just seem invisible to us, right? The connections between, for instance, investment in urban growth, or the connections between professionals in far-flung areas of the country, or how capital works, or how lending works. But we see that from maps like this, regardless of how the different layers we might be able to sort of process at any one time, at the end of the day, redlining continues to shape the landscape itself. Okay? Thank you. So, yeah, I think, what are we going to do with questions?
I'm going to go ahead and if you have a question, okay. And I'll come around with the microphone.
Okay.
So everyone can hear.
Yes.
What does all of what you said tonight tie into the Trump family process? I think that was in New York City. And when was that?
Yeah. I guess, should I take back the microphone? So just to make sure everyone could keep hearing me. Thank you. That's a great question. I know we heard laughter, right? Because we're like, okay, thinking about politics. But this is exactly the point, right? About thinking about intergenerational power, right? And how real estate can help us think about the way wealth can create uneven political power. It's exactly that. So that was a few different times. And I say this as someone from just a few neighborhoods over from where that stuff was. Originally, it began with FHA post-war housing. So essentially, giant apartment buildings were essentially built as part of what were called urban renewal projects in in Brooklyn. Urban renewal projects took the criteria of redlining to determine what areas essentially should be demolished, should be cleared as unsalvageable in a post-war world. And there were large pots of money that were then delegated, often through private lenders, to people who, again, followed certain criteria. The Trump family was willing and very able to essentially follow these criteria in certain ways, like a lot of their peers, and make a huge profit off segregated real estate. And in fact, in Baltimore today, the outskirts of Baltimore, and this is why I kept using the word historically, oftentimes today, actually, with people returning to cities with gentrification, it's actually peripheral areas that are sometimes now very working class. And in Baltimore, there's a whole sort of set of just like townhouses and kind of cheap apartments on the outskirts going out to the airport, all of which are owned by subsidiaries of Jared Kushner. And oftentimes, the way that those companies make their profit is not fixing anything and then evicting people who complain. So the sort of trafficking in eviction has become a new way of profiting off poverty in the suburbs. And that's something that has also been sort of documented quite a bit in relation to the Trump family. But the sad thing is they're very typical in that sense, which is why thinking about it as a question of power, I think, gets us to like, how does that continue to matter even as we get different presidents? Mm-hmm.
That's been a big issue in Milwaukee as well, the business of eviction, has it not?
Right. And has anyone read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted? Yeah. It's very much about, I love that, the business of eviction. So I talked about how segregation is profitable, but actually one of the really good books on that table in the back called Race for Profit has a whole idea called predatory inclusion, about how essentially there is a type of business from creating, say, access to potentially affordable homes or home ownership opportunities, often in the case of that author, Keonghya Taylor, for poor Black women who never really have a chance to actually have those homes become assets for them because they're lemons from the start. And they end up being profitable through, again, things like eviction and foreclosure. So the business of predatory inclusion is another side to this history of segregation, which I talked about as exclusion. Mm-hmm.
So in a parallel universe between Milwaukee and Kenosha, the uptown area here had experienced difficulties, shall we say, And now a shovel-ready project was ready rather quickly to the area that needed it, which I thought was, quite wonderful, right? And then we have a similar situation in Milwaukee where they had enough money to get the new rail system that they employed just outside of Harambe, which is the second most segregated area, I believe, in the country, at least the last time I checked the data. So are you seeing a pattern in the data where developers, with the help of federal and state and local governments, we'll give them inadvertently creating opportunities for people at the expense of the people they're supposed to be serving?
That story changes depending on the decade you're in. But in general, just like with this tree map, I think that you are much more likely to see neighborhoods that have more political power essentially be able to more successfully advocate for the types of resources they want. In the 2000s, that might include access to train lines. But actually in like the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, it would have been the opposite. They're like, keep the light rail away from us, keep a train station away from us, because that would bring in, and again, use your coded language there, but it would bring in undesirable people, which is a kind of word you sometimes would hear. So there's a history to that too, where the desired resource itself potentially changes. But what the pattern is then is seeing that kind of uneven ability to advocate for a type of amenity. And I think this is a great way of really tying together how you see political power in that hyper-local way, right? In either a place that is historically a wealthy neighborhood, but it's also what you see happening with gentrification, where areas that potentially had a history of disinvestment have become, for a variety of reasons we could probably spend all night talking about, right? Now potentially are more affluent, likely more white, but that's actually kind of uneven. And when you see an area become gentrified, you always see an increase in services, things like timely garbage pickup, fire response time, and that's of course also to say you see the whole lending and investment landscape change. So it's easier for a business to get a loan if they are a business that's kind of in the service of gentrifying a neighborhood, even though there probably were businesses in that neighborhood prior to gentrification that may have had trouble getting a loan, right? So access to things really does correlate with the ways that wealth and race and class all work together. But that's not a static story. The desirability, actually, like the amenities themselves, really do shift over the decades.
I'm wondering if you've given this talk before to realtor groups. and along with those lines, has there been any kind of movement on the part of national realtor associations to really understand the reckoning of what they've caused? I lived in Northwest Indiana in the 80s and 90s, and up to at least mid-1990s, it was virtually impossible for an African American family to be able to look at a home in Valparaiso, Indiana. The realtors in Porter County would not show families of color homes, and it eventually ended up taking some local church groups to recruit families and do some things to change, and things have, I think, changed at least a little bit there. But have realtor groups responded to this in any way?
It's funny. Some of the people who actually most love to hear me speak are realtors and people who live in segregated suburbs. And I kind of had to ask myself why. Like the folks in Guilford would invite me out all the time. I mean, it was walking distance where I live, but they invite me all the time. And I was like, why? And I realized that for some people, for some of those folks, they really saw themselves as separate from the history, where they said, okay, I live in a place where maybe my grandparents were, guilty of doing these things, but I'm not. I'm different. And so the history in some ways provided a sense of comfort that I think was a little bit unproductive in terms of how to think about it. So what I tried to do, and this applied to realtor groups too, also to planning boards. There's been some interest from kind of regional and local planning boards to get more of like the history of planning side of this story. And on one hand, I love that people want to know this history, especially people who have directly benefit from it, because it does potentially provide the tools to ask, how can I use my position to make a difference, because people might be in that position where they might have more resources to do something if they wanted to. On the other hand, this is something that is very systemic, right? So it's very hard potentially for people to kind of think about, again, how this could be like an instead of interpersonal solutions, like, oh, me, Guilford resident, I could talk to a neighbor and therefore we can both disavow restrictive covenants. That doesn't necessarily change the bigger history of resource or the future of resource distribution, right? But what realtors I found realtors who are a giant diffuse group of people who don't all know each other or talk to each other. What I found very interesting is that on one hand, groups kind of acknowledge the types of techniques that still go on, such as racial steering, right? Which is illegal but absolutely pervasive. On the other hand, where people, I think, draw the line is trying to rethink what property value could include. So race is still tied to property value. Like, categorically, 100%, that is all the data you will ever find, like, in any field. But how to disentangle that requires intellectual work, not just, say, like a redistribution of resources, which I also think could potentially be very, very important to discuss. But I find it much harder for people to want to do the intellectual work of re-envisioning what it might mean to be a realtor, what it might mean to be a homeowner who benefits from appreciation of a house, what it means to benefit from intergenerational wealth when that intergenerational wealth is due to other people not having intergenerational wealth. That intellectual work is really hard, but I think also really necessary. And I think that's where the history can be very, very, very useful. So while I do think there needs to be an absolute kind of discussion about how that might lead to, say, reparative measures, especially at like a bigger level than any individual, I think kind of being willing to think, okay, my job is all about essentially it's still about taking these ideas about race and property value as a baseline assumption of what's good. That needs to be reckoned with. And I think that needs to be done at least through many different ways, but including through continued conversation and through sitting with discomfort.
Hi, I grew up in the Sherman Park neighborhood of Milwaukee, and my parents marched with Father Grappi specifically about redlining, and I always was left with the impression that it was really bad banking practices. But now I'm wondering if that was maybe just an extension of that Hulk or whatever you called it. So which came first, the bad banking practices or?
They both kind of reinforced each other. So there's a parallel story to the realtor story, which is what mortgage bankers were doing also during the 1910s and 1920s. And banking was already segregated prior to the New Deal. It was like very, very difficult for, say, a black-owned bank to have the same access to capital as a white-owned bank, regardless of, say, whatever the managerial decisions were of the bank. That then affected, say, like how a bank that like maybe was white-owned would also want to only issue mortgages to white people, and they would have more resources to do that than, say, a black-owned bank that might have really wanted to invest in a community and try to increase black homeownership. There was just not equal opportunity in the banking, because of an even longer history of how capital itself is segregated, right? I actually didn't share this part tonight, but I start my book not in Baltimore, but actually with British investors, and how you have to understand the history of segregated suburbs with how money is moving around the world, and why people actually wanted to park some of that in American housing segregation. So the banking story predates the New Deal. However, just like with the realtor piece, they help write the rules of the federal policy, because mortgage bankers themselves were also considered experts, and federal administrators wanted experts to help write those New Deal rules. So what the kind of policy moment does with Hulk and with the FHA is it kind of creates a standardized moment that essentially sets the lending industry and sets federal policy into a certain direction, where it not only endorses but throws a lot of resources behind a very narrow view of what housing could look like. And even as that changes, right, and it does change a lot in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there are additional housing policies that are made. Laws change, questions around access to affordable homes, that's all changing constantly. But the banking, at that point, realtors, bankers, and federal administrators still essentially continue to collaborate on a way in which how like the language of the policy apparatus, the legal apparatus, and the finance are all going to work together, because the banking is done in the regulatory apparatus, real estate's done in a more of a state level, but regulatory apparatus, and then there's the administration of the law itself. So it's all very much mutually reinforcing. And I would say that then, even as the kind of height of the suburban boom sort of peaks and you start to have a different kind of built environment really being talked about in terms of federal housing policy going into the 70s, 80s, 90s, what unites everyone? And ultimately what it comes down to when thinking about real estate as buying and selling houses, or thinking about real estate in terms of mortgages, or thinking about real estate in terms of fair housing laws, you still ultimately get back to the centrality of property value. It's really there as I think that's kind of the biggest through line, in that kind of notion that a piece of land has value, and that value has to be appraised by certain criteria to qualify for certain types of things, whether it's banking, whether it's policy access or whatnot. It's that kind of piece that really helps to, I think, answer the question of why housing segregation has been so pervasive. And a lot of that is a financial story.
And the covenants, a fraction of any percent of white or black, what were they? Because at one point, again, in the big read, there is that crossover.
Mm-hmm.
And again, in a point of Kenosha, we now have concerns about what's happening with anti-Semitism,
Mm-hmm.
which I could not believe have happened, but which the legal system says it's okay because it's freedom of speech versus, anything else of, an infringement upon a landowner of having something he has to pick up off of his driveway that he doesn't want there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and the kind of muddled lack of numbers, of hard numbers, is I think how some of this worked. You wouldn't necessarily see X percent Jewish okay. There weren't necessarily quotas or X percent the right type of Southern European okay. The fact that it was so discretionary is, I think, historically, even when you leave the realm of housing, leaving that kind of discretion in the hands of people with power, whether they're salesmen, whether they're people who allow folks to say, cross the street without threat of violence, that discretion is oftentimes how you essentially have the continuation of different types of discriminatory practices, regardless of, say, changes in the law. For example, in the 1920s, in Chicago, right, during the Great Migration with African Americans, you have essentially people boxed into the South Side of Chicago, what was called the Black Belt. But the way that was enforced was the ever-present threat of violence, or if people tried to essentially cross the color line and buy a house outside of that. People bombed other people's houses in Chicago in the 1920s. That was never quantified in the sense of we'll let X number of African Americans cross the street. It was more like, hey guys, I heard this, let's go bomb this house tonight to stop this person from moving in. That discretionary sort of threat of violence is really, really powerful, and one of the ways that I think anti-Semitism continues to work and racial practices continue to work. So I can kind of lay out the context, right, in which for housing, which now is intersecting more and more with the free speech, language of free speech. But what I really see in that sort of stuff is I see a much longer history in which people essentially, rather than call something anti-Semitism, say, we'll just have a conversation about it. Or rather than say, we don't want black people to cross a color line, they'll say, let's get together in the middle of the night. That sort of, that threat of violence without numbers is really, really pernicious, but it goes back much longer. So you can see it in housing violence, but I think that there's kind of something to that to kind of think about, why does something like anti-Semitism continue to yield this type of vitriol in places like Kenosha, it's because you have all of this sort of these conversations with things that go unsaid in public, or maybe unsaid in terms of their quantification, but there's still conversations that are kind of happening sometimes with people with the power to commit harm. So I hope that helps. It's like, it gets into a much bigger history that leaves just the housing history. But thinking about maybe one way to go about it is also then thinking about the kind of ways that this history of housing segregation included overlapping in different types of thought about like the value of people can maybe help us to also understand why some of these potentially anti-Semitic ideas and practices and racist ideas and practices continue to persist, because those conversations they continue to happen, maybe they just sort of go away, or they're a little more hidden than they used to be. So.
Your data have any gender? Because white women were not able to purchase property on their own until the Married Women's Credit Act was done federally, and even that took about 10 years to have any real impact. And the disparity is still there, from what I can tell, from the data that I've been seeing.
So if I had just hours, I could walk you through more of the exclusion files that actually also talked about the practices of housewives and how that qualified or disqualified people from living in Roland Park because they didn't conform to the kind of notions of what like a good housewife meant. Yes, there is absolutely a gendered history to all of this, including credit discrimination. But I think that this is where it's important to think about how discrimination happens, but doesn't necessarily happen the same way to people at time or the same way to people over time. So it's absolutely true that it would have been harder for a woman of any race to try and essentially get a mortgage. Like whether it's a government insured mortgage or a conventional mortgage, women had less access to financial resources, in part because until basically, before the credit piece that you mentioned, into the late 19th century, there were plenty of states where a woman, once she got married, no longer legally had a financial identity. There were laws called laws of coverture, which were all about how a woman's financial identity gets subsumed into that of her husband's. So if she had a great credit record on her own, and she married someone who had a terrible credit record, then that only the terrible credit record counted for both of them. She disappeared as a financial actor. And when it came to certain post-war policies, I didn't mention the GI Bill. But the GI Bill from the Veterans Administration was another agency that adopted all of Holk's criteria. And it's one of the reasons why the post-war boom took on a very segregated form, now racially, but also who qualified as a veteran to get easy access to really good mortgages included a definition of military combat. So even though women were heavily involved in the war effort, including within several types of civilian positions on, say, army bases, they oftentimes didn't qualify because of the gendered way that war service was thought of, in a very narrow way that service was thought of. So even there, in that one piece of legislation that completely changed the game for millions and millions of Americans who gained access to home ownership, at that moment, it was gender and it was also race working in some ways together, right? It would be even harder for a black woman to get any type of financial resources than a white woman, but being a woman really, really limited you. So you see the different ways that comes out. And I think it's no coincidence that the law about kind of credit equality, about non-discrimination in credit, tried to tackle race and gender at the same time, because there was a dual history of how lending discrimination really, really essentially stopped people from being able to accumulate wealth, access wealth, and also pass it on to future generations.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for spending their evening with us. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We do have a ton of material in the back to check out if you want to take some time, look around. And we have our insider and then our pamphlet with the rest of our big read events, which are going to go into May. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.